Thanks for joining us today from a number of places around BC and Canada and beyond. To begin today, I would like to acknowledge my gratitude for the chance to work, live, and play on the lands of the Ktunaxa, Sinixt, Sielks, Kwekletene, and Secwepemc peoples. And we invite you to share the lands you live on and are participating from today in the chat section if you would like. I would like to particularly thank the recovery group that is helping create these sessions, and also the BC Association of Emergency Managers for supporting and hosting the sessions. Any resources or information or comments you have to share can be added to the chat section throughout the session today. And at the end of each session, the summary notes, along with all links shared and presenters' contact information, will be sent out to those attending today. The sessions are being recorded and will be kept on the BC Association of Emergency Managers membership page, the tools and resources page. And finally, the first and second sessions are now loaded, though the February 10th session is audio only, and hopefully the rest will all be video and audio accessible. During the presentations, please keep your video and audio turned off, as for some attending, it can offer challenges with instability of connection. So on February 10th, the topic of funding was explored with specifics about resources, sources, and accessibility in regards to recovery projects. And the presentations today will be a Southern perspective from Australia and New Zealand. It'll take about approximately 35 minutes or so for both presentations, followed by the opportunity for discussion and Q&A with both presenters. And now I would like to introduce Louise Mitchell. Louise Mitchell is the National Consultant Disaster Recovery for the Australian Social Recovery Reference Group and is from Woodend, Victoria, Australia. Louise supports the Social Recovery Reference Group organizations across Australia as they collaborate to continue to grow human and social recovery capability in agencies that support communities. This group shares policy and practice and advocates for the centrality of both individuals and community to successful recovery. Prior to this role, Louise worked at the Australian Emergency Management Institute for 16 years, with a focus on adult education and developing and facilitating workshops to continue to progress emergency management. Louise is undertaking some research focused on the 19/20 recovery response that follows on from the community-led project that the SRRG led in 2019. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Louise. Go ahead, please, Louise.
Thanks very much, Deb. Nice to be here with you all. I've long wanted to come over to Canada, so one day I'll get there, just not right now. My husband too, he's a sculptor, so he wants to come over and see the beautiful Indigenous totems on stage. So I too would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal people, the First Nations of this land, the Dja Dja Wurrung, and the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging, and any First Nations people here with us today. I'll just see if I can get my PowerPoint working. Share screen. How does that look? Is that good, Deb?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, so it's a rather curious collaboration I work for. It's all of the people in government around the states and territories of Australia basically have come together and pooled some of their funding, with the federal government paying 25% and the rest paying by population for my wage, in order to enable them to collaborate together across the functions that they do, which includes providing relief payments, working with their partners to set up evacuation centres, making sure that their services for people, which are named quite a few different things around Australia, like case management. I know in New Zealand, they're called navigator services, and sometimes they're called bushfire recovery support. So those services to individual families and households. And then also the community recovery officer programs that they bring in, that's more about the collective. So they're just some of the functions that our government services provide. And I work sort of across all of those agencies for the executive directors, trying to bring a national focus. And we've had really big governance changes in our space with the introduction of the National Bushfire Recovery Agency after our really big season in 2019 and 20, which basically Queensland was hit by fires. There's been unprecedented fires up there in tropical rainforest areas as well that have been hit. So climate change is really impacting us. New South Wales was hit enormously, and I've been working alongside a local government, particularly down here in Bega, which was 65% burnt out and 465 houses. And that's just one of something like 25 local government areas, all up and down the coast, that were hit hard. And Victoria had fires, particularly along the border. So we had lots of cross-border issues we had to solve, and South Australia as well, including Kangaroo Island, which I don't know if you've heard of it. It's just the most beautiful place. It had an incredible conference centre, which was totally burnt out. So that's who I work for. It's a position that's been going since 1984. And it's just a pretty unique and wonderful thing to be doing. And this is where I live, in just outside of Melbourne, about an hour's drive. In Victoria, we do have more roads than this one. It's just that they didn't show up in my screenshot. And it's a beautiful part of the world here in the Macedon Ranges in Victoria. So the Social Recovery Reference Group back in the early, it was actually back in the 1990s, developed some national principles for disaster recovery, because you can't really have here's your steps to get from A to B and make sure your community is recovered. It's really got to be principles based, and these principles are integrated. So while I'm talking today about the work we've done on community-led approaches, I just want to make the point that each of these is interwoven. It's been a lot of the narrative here in Australia, and from the new agencies as well, has been, we've got to be community led. We've got to be listening to the community and working from what they want, which raises all sorts of questions like, who is the community? Well, the community was never homogenous before. That's what makes the rich diversity of these communities we live in, because we're all quite different and we have to work to where we're going. And that's why we have our democracies. But in order to use community-led approaches, we have to build the capacity in the community. If it's not being built beforehand, we have to bring in our services and strategies afterwards to help to build that capacity and acknowledge the capacity that exists. So strengths-based approach and all of those other things, understand the context, recognize complexity, communicate effectively and coordinate well. Easy to roll off the tongue. Each of those is really not so easy to do. So in the links that we can put in the chat, or I can put it in the chat later, or maybe Alexa will, I sent them to her earlier. You'll see that we've got a page on our principles, and it comes with a flyer that has successful recovery is this, in terms of recognizing complexity, and about 6 to 8 dot points on each. So I really think these principles are excellent. You may have your own there in Canada. We've also got checklists to use either before, during, or after disaster for each of those 6 principles, for people on the ground to say, oh, how am I doing this? How do we apply this? And what are we seeing as a result? So in 2018-19, I ran a project that the group asked me to do. And the question was, well, how can we support community-led recovery and maintain the coordination that we need to maintain? In other words, there's a whole lot of political pressure about what are you doing, what's getting done, what's getting achieved. And community-led recovery is essentially a a developmental approach, not a programmatic approach. So we'll send you the links to these two. We did a literature review on this, what's government's role in supporting community-led approaches to recovery. Then I looked at case studies, which I'll just give you an overview of in a minute. And out of those, we developed a report to say, here's some things you need to consider as government when you're supporting community-led recovery, or if you want to support and enable. So one of the interesting things we found in the literature review is that community-led, in our normal routine society, there are some things that are wholly citizen and community initiated and led. I'm just going to move my picture because I can't see my screen. And there are other things that are supported by government, and they wouldn't happen unless there was that government facilitation and support. And so there is a spectrum of community-led, and we see that in routine times, and we see that after disasters. I'm just going to go across here and take a breath for a second. I had an example here, and I can't find it. Whoops. Okay. So I'll just go back there. So we also said that there's two ways out of the literature review that that we can use, or community-led approaches are seen through the actions that people take. So we see people opening relief centres. We also see agencies coming in and saying, we're here now, you can step aside. And that is totally disempowering for people, and they obviously react. So there's the action, and then there's the participation in decision-making, which I might focus on a bit today and talk more about. So in that, we also unpacked, well, what are these two systems? The sort of developmental system, where individual residents and community operate through social norms and expectations and reciprocity. So I might go and help my girlfriend and look after her children one day when I'm not working, and she'll help me with something else at some other time. So all of that sort of stuff happens. A lot of voluntary stuff in communities, relationships, social capital, whereas our external public agencies, of course, are more formal and hierarchical and try to be adaptive, but they usually have objectives and a programmatic approach that they're working to. So on the left-hand side, this was a beautiful quote from a member of a men's shed. I didn't know there was a place called Texas in Australia, but there is. Texas in Queensland, Texas men's shed. And he said, in community, you just have to have something that keeps your heart alive. So that speaks really to the spirit that exists in community. We're not usually paying people to do things, whereas organisations, projects, programs, managing resources, accountability and transparency. So there's kind of two different really philosophical approaches in both systems. So bridging those, what we talk about in the report, this comes from Eileen Conn's work in the UK. She talks of this central piece being the space of possibilities. And so we were looking at the literature, and there's a whole lot around co-production. So it's also the space of co-production, how we work together with those hierarchical organisations and the organic and bridge those. So we did some case studies to try and have a look at this. And there's so many ways that community-led can appear. And I'll just tell you a few of the case studies, and you can go and look at them in more detail if it appeals to you. So in Ravenshoe, they had an explosion in the main part of their town. A gas tank exploded. They set up an appeal committee, and that appeal committee was made up from people from the community. And what made that work, so we were really looking for examples where it worked well, so we could pull on best practice rather than always going to, oh, what were the challenges, what didn't work. So what worked there was they really had good governance and they took care of that. They involved local voices on the committee. So this was deciding how the money was going to be allocated that was donated. But they made sure that each of those people had clear roles. So they'd be protected in those roles. So someone who was from the local bank, and they were there absolutely for accountability, but in their role from the local bank. So things like that. Bundaberg is a fabulous example of where there just wasn't enough money for those people who didn't have the money to repair their houses after a flood, and they get flooded a lot in Bundaberg. I think this was a sequential flood. And so they got together with some of the non-government organisations, government and non-government, and they held quite a number of conversations and worked up a process where they'd work alongside each other with volunteers, and they actually used some of the grey nomads. So they got a director in, so the Department of Communities paid someone to come and direct this program. They were employed through the non-government organisation, and they had links to all of these grey nomad tradies who came in and volunteered their time. And they had to make sure that there were those safety protections there as well. So all of the plastering and stuff was done by volunteers, and materials were donated in order to get people who otherwise didn't have adequate housing back into their houses. So I won't go through each one, but I think these are all fabulous examples of the variety of different types of approaches to community-led recovery. So you can have a look at those in your own time. But I will tell you a little bit at the end about Nauru, because Deb asked me if we had any examples from Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander communities. So I'll talk about that in a minute. One of the things that we said was in our model, so this is sort of up the top of that picture you saw before, we talked about, well, what are we aiming for? Really, we're aiming for communities that can determine their own needs and shape their own future throughout their recovery. And we really came up with the fact that they will need government support. We need to work together. It's a disaster. So it's very rare. There have been cases where, like in Strathewen, a little town of 200 people, and they actually lost 27 people after the 2009 bushfires. They decided to run their own recovery committee separate to any local government or municipal input. And so they were very self-contained. They had a lot of capacity in their community, lawyers and accountants and others and they had amazing principles. So that's a fabulous example. And they've taken that model this year also to Malakuta, where they had last year in 2020, where they had huge fires. You would have seen the pictures of people on the beach and being evacuated on Navy boats, perhaps, round to Melbourne. So they had the Australian Electoral Commission come and Deb, tell me if give me 2 minutes warning and I'll speed up.
Okay.
So they had the Australian Electoral Commission come in to conduct voting on who might lead their recovery, and that's community outside local government. I'm pretty sure Strathewen was. I'm not sure if Malakuta is outside local government, or whether they work side by side with local government. So yeah, anyway, we developed, we said, okay, here's what we're aiming for if governments are supporting community-led coordinated recovery, and here's what success looks like. And in order to get there, on the community side, we need to go in and listen, hold space, not say you've got to rebuild by a certain time, because it actually doesn't happen. Support and enable individuals, households, and with the groups that already exist, because there's already a lot of capacity in many communities. We need to partner, collaborate, recognise and build capacity and capabilities. And amongst ourselves in our organisations, We need to coordinate to serve community priorities, adapt policy and intervene appropriately. And over here is the stuff around understanding and sharing power and responsibility, which government has a lot of. And over here, it's to enable and support collective self-efficacy. So that's our model. I won't go into that, but really it was around action and decision-making. That's how we can enable through supporting communities in their action and also involving them in and sharing responsibility and power in decision-making. Again, not always easy, but in terms of the decision-making, all of our coordination and governance structures can assist that. In some places, they set up community recovery reference groups that can speak to local government. Sorry, that can also link in with the regional recovery committees, the state recovery committees across to the state level and the national level agencies. So there's the governance arrangements, which I'm sure that you have too. And this is not always easy either. So representation after the 2009 bushfires, they had a debrief with the heads of the community recovery committees 2.5 years later. And some of those leaders said that after that workshop where they really talked about the lessons they learned, the messages for government, some said that was the first sleep, really good sleep I've had in 2.5 years because I've been holding so much responsibility on behalf of my community.
Sorry, Louise, 2 minutes.
Okay, so you'll get these slides. Have a read of that one because I think that is really powerful. Glavich's work is really good. And I'm going to skip over these a little bit, but I'll just talk to it quickly. We put in so much capital after a disaster. That fine line is the disaster event, and then we actually invest in so much capital replacement after a disaster. I'd love us to see that line also representing what we do in community engagement. It doesn't have to be whole of community, but how we actually talk with communities. And my point on this slide was really, we can do so much back here. And it's all about what was happening before with the overlay of the disaster. So we can't forget that and the preparedness. And I won't tell the story associated with that previous slide, but this one's about Nauru. So Nauru floods every year, or not every year, but every couple of years. It's in a floodplain. It's an Aboriginal mission settlement with quite a number of Aboriginal community nations that have been settled there as a result of colonisation. So in talking to Miriam Rose Ungamar, who is actually just been awarded an Australian of the Year, the Elder Australian of the Year, a Red Cross person who works closely with her, interviewed her for the case study. And basically we found that it's all about the relationship focus for them, learning how to be with each other. There was really a lot of importance placed on the role of community leaders as mediators, having appropriate communication from agencies and from community leaders that promotes calm, connectedness and hope, and continuity of relationship. And this was one of the wonderful things that came out of the work that agencies have been doing in developing relationships with the community. After Cyclone Trevor, basically because they get totally evacuated from their community to Darwin, which you can see on this map is it's about 3 or 4 hours away. What they did after 2019 was have the elders, because being on, as you know, being on country and being taken off country can really destabilize, I guess, some of the youth, some of the cultural norms and practices. So to have the traditional owners of Darwin welcome the community to their lands, say, you will respect our land, we will show you respect, you won't get any trouble from our mob and we expect you to show respect, enabled them to link in also with the Larrakia people's resources. So there's some really interesting things in that case study. So thanks for your time. I did overshoot and try to share too much there, but I'll be happy to answer any questions later. Thanks, Deb.
Oh, thank you so much, Louise. That was really interesting. And yes, I bet you could go on and we could have hour-long conversations times many, which we will in future, I hope. Okay, our second speaker today hails from New Zealand. And in the invitation email sent out, the Community Hub Guide link was included, which Scott will be discussing in his presentation, I believe. We can repost it for those who no longer have that email, along with, there's another explanation of the guide there that we have links for that will go in. Scott Dray is the Senior Emergency Management Advisor Recovery, Wellington Region Emergency Management Office, or REMO, in Wellington, New Zealand. Scott has worked in the emergency services and emergency management sector for over 20 years. For the last 8 years, he's been working with the Wellington Region Emergency Management Office, working with communities as the team leader of the Community Resilience Team, and more recently as a Senior Advisor in Recovery. So welcome, Scott, and please go ahead.
Kia ora, everybody. Thank you, Deb, for that introduction. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations people who are listening in here today. It's a real honour to be able to speak to you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. And I look forward to sharing some of the insights from our experiences down here in New Zealand. So I'm going to approach this today from a little bit more, I guess, from a practitioner's experience, really acknowledging the comments Lou was making around, listening to community, empowering them in the process of recovery, and helping build that capacity within community so that they can be an equal player. So I'll step you through a PowerPoint I've got at the moment. I think, I can't click on this and do the slides, can I? So I'll just tell you to do the next slide, Deb, or Aleska. So if you want to do the next slide, that'd be great. Great. So we have acknowledged basically from both events here in New Zealand and overseas that communities really want to help support themselves during disasters as much as possible. Often they've felt a little bit disempowered because they just don't know what to do. But really it's in those kind of situations when there's a dearth of official support, i.e. from the emergency services or governments, because of the situation that's occurred and they've been disconnected, that communities have really stepped up and done some pretty fabulous things. So just in the photos there that you can see, top left corner there is the student volunteer army that stepped up, completely organic response there in Christchurch, where they helped clean the streets up from liquefaction and checked on neighbours and identified hazards. Below that is community responders in Haiti, following the earthquake there, actually doing a lot of the rescuing and clearing rubble to improve access to the streets. Top right-hand corner is something a bit more closer to home to you guys, is Hurricane Katrina, where we saw some fantastic examples of neighbours helping neighbours, getting their own boats out to rescue people from their flooded homes. And below that is, I think, an example from Queensland following a cyclone over there, where the neighbours all got out and helped clean up their streets and supported one another. So, it's really where the magic happens when that community response, gets going. But one of the biggest challenges that we've faced as a sector is how do we connect with it? And how do we enable that community response so it has a structure so that civil defence or the emergency services can coordinate with it and support it so that it can actually happen much faster and be more effective. So next slide. You right? Yep. So we've got the official response shown by the circle on the right there, with its nice linear command and control type system with people with nice clear role descriptions and responsibilities, and then compare that to the left-hand circle which is representative of the community. It's actually a much bigger circle because community actually has a lot more capacity than probably the official response in terms of just numbers, skill sets, resources. But it's that spaghetti mess of relationships, which is very hard to connect to in terms of like getting that one clear voice or consensus. So the challenge we've had in the Wellington region is, well, how do we try and bring those two interdependent systems together so that they're more coordinated and can talk to one another and can support each other. So next slide. Our solution was to actually try and identify a community gathering point, somewhere that was pre-identified before a disaster, where the community could gather, share resources, share skill sets, support one another, and connect with the official response. The name of that facility, if you move to the next slide, is called the Community Emergency Hub. So we considered a whole range of different names for what these facilities could be called. Traditionally, they used to be called civil defence centres, and they kind of were something that was run by civil defence. We trained volunteers to sit in them, but the reality was, in a significant event, we wouldn't have enough volunteers to support the community, and it also that whole need to actually have trained civil defence volunteers to open them up and run them, it disempowered or disenfranchised the rest of the community. And really, a lot of the problem solving that needs to take place to support a community is not rocket science. You don't need a qualification. Many people have got that, the kind of skill sets that are from their day jobs or life experiences they could utilise to support themselves and their community during disaster. So Community Emergency Hub was the name we gave to the facility. Obviously, the word community really emphasises who it's for. The word emergency really emphasises what it's for. And the hub was a slightly less formal kind of name for a gathering point. So we now have 132 community emergency hubs across the Wellington region, which are located in reasonable walking distance for everyone within the community as much as possible. And the concept is also expanding to other civil defence groups throughout New Zealand and even abroad to other countries. And I'll step you through why it's been such a successful model both here and in other communities very shortly. So I guess next slide. The hub is really the bridge between the community and the official response. And we've got this kind of holistic model that starts, if you go to the next slide, at the household level, where we encourage people to be personally prepared and prepared in their homes and work collaboratively with their neighbours. Next slide. To also work with their local street and immediate neighbourhood to share resources and skill sets. And if they can't solve problems with it at that level, or they have spare capacity, they can actually go and connect to their wider community and the assets within the wider community to help problem solve via their community emergency hub. So the next slide. The hub has the capacity to connect to our emergency operations centre. So that's where the official civil defence emergency services operate out of. Every territorial authority in New Zealand has an emergency operations centre, and they have the capacity through a VHF network to connect to each of these different hubs. We realise that the VHF radios have significant limitations in terms of the amount of data that can be transferred over them. We are moving towards setting up mobile hotspots in our hubs so that we can actually in time enable our communities to pass through information via a laptop or even a cell phone. But I think the real thing I'd like to emphasize here is that we are now really seriously integrating that hub into the part of the official, into the holistic model of responding to a disaster. So those hubs now, and we've been through a number of different events, and I'll talk to you about one that's just recently happened in Southland, which has adopted the hub model, are now providing amazing situational awareness on what's happening within communities, and communities are actually able to actually direct what's needed in their own communities, rather than the old days where civil defence used to assume what was needed in those communities, send them a whole pile of blankets or things that they really didn't need. It's now being a lot more community-led. The hub is not defined by the facility. The hub is defined by the problem-solving framework that was set up within the hub. And I'll step you very shortly through how we've gone about setting up that framework. So the next slide is just really acknowledging now that the hubs are now integrated with our emergency operations centres. They report into our intelligence desk. We can task hubs. Hubs can also inform us as to what their needs are. And it's very much more community-led disaster response as a result. Obviously, each emergency operations centre, the next slide, reports up to our emergency coordination centre, which each region in the country has an emergency coordination centre, which can access resources and support from the national office or from abroad, overseas. So basically, what I've just shown you there is a model that starts from preparedness at the home, at the individual household level, and linking that right through via the hub to the very top end of the official response. So we've actually turned the whole model on its head, where it used to be that direction in terms of the civil defence response was very much top down. The decision making was being done very much at the very high official level, to now giving a much greater voice via the hub from the community's perspective. So that's kind of how it works in the response stage, but that also translates very well also into recovery. And I'll touch on that towards the end of the slide pack. So next slide. So how do we create that framework within the hubs? Because as I said, the hub is not defined by the actual gathering point. I mean, a hub could actually operate from the back of a car boot if necessary. We do pre-identify locations, so people do know where they can initially gather, and we try and identify safe locations such as that are suitable for the public and large bodies of people. So we'd try and identify a community hall or a part of a school, or a local marae, which is where our Indigenous population have their gathering place. So they can operate from any of those kind of locations so long as they're accessible, they're safe in terms of they're not in a earthquake-prone building. But they can also change if any of those structures were damaged. But the hub is really about the problem-solving framework that we set up. So when we go into communities, it's a 3-session process followed by ongoing 18-month reviews. And as time goes by, we're seeing the communities increasingly take the lead on running their own hub exercises and also doing their own kind of reviews, because they're starting to feel more empowered. They're getting the chance to practice it, and they really see how much of a part they can play in influencing not only the response to dealing with whatever is happening in the community following a disaster, but also the recovery process. So when we first go into a community, we'll go in and we will try and identify community champions, like church leaders, could be members of the local elected members, could be sports group coordinators, all sorts of people that kind of have good solid networks within the community and mana, i.e. respect within the community. So we'll try and target them to come along to these sessions and encourage others to join them. The first session is really around trying to explore what kind of impacts the community could be affected by. And we use often an earthquake scenario, which is the worst case scenario for us here in the Wellington region. It's kind of a scenario where a hub really would come into its own. The community could be highly isolated, be without any kind of official support for possibly days, even weeks. And they really will be having to utilize their own skill sets, their own resources to perhaps get through on those first few days. So that's where the hub really, we really emphasize where the hub really adds value and the importance of it. So we'll look at all the different kind of impacts the community could face, And we'll look at the kind of social and physical resources that sit within the community that might be able to be called upon to help address some of their needs. We'll also identify some of the strengths that are inherent within the community. They could be highly networked. They could have a high number of people who have technical skills, or they could have a polytech or things like that, where they could do communal cooking or whatever else. We'll also identify some of the vulnerabilities that are inherent within the community, such as they might have a number of bridges that are prone to perhaps being knocked out, or they might be built on flood-prone land, things like that. So that's really doing that initial scan. And the second session is really then looking at what are some of the common problems all communities will probably face following a significant disaster. Some of the things that they'll most likely need to be addressing, and civil defence would also be wanting to address. So let's have a look at what kind of things would they need to be trying to problem solve. And there'd be things like, well, how are you going to carry out a level of rescue or checking on people following the disaster? How would you carry out some kind of medical care of people within the community? Where could you set up a temporary triage facility, perhaps? Or what kind of, how could you utilise some of the existing assets within the community, such as your doctor's surgery, your veterinary clinic? What kind of shelter do you have, and shelter facilities? Like, do you have any other kind of public facilities or large halls that could be used to provide emergency shelter? And so we list those kind of 6 common problems that a community would have to address, and then we look at what kind of some of the solutions that the community have to try and solve some of those problems. So we'll do a bit of an asset mapping exercise, if you like, and start to list some of those solutions. The final session is really about building that social connectivity, that social capital. So it's actually moving beyond just the realms of emergency management lens. We're trying to say, well, how can we continue to make sure that you stay networked and you stay strongly engaged with one another? So it's really about the third session is we're exploring ways and means in which the community can come together based on what they are interested in. So it could be things that we will support, or things like doing a beach cleanup, running a community garden, and we'll help them a little bit with getting those projects up and running, and bring in other players such as the council or community development teams to help with the community with those kind of initiatives. So ultimately, the final outcome of all this, if you go to the next slide, is we develop a localized community emergency hub guide. So the guide is what I was talking about. It's the problem-solving framework that enables community and gives them the capacity to come together to problem solve and structure themselves in such a way that we've got a better ability to link with community. And there is a better chance to get that that consensus voice from community about what's needed, and they can better represent themselves as part of that, and part of that holistic kind of model I was talking about. So the next slide, just stepping you through. So this guide has been an iterative process. It's been under development for the last 6 or 7 years since we first developed it, and it's constantly evolving as we get feedback from community. And I think it's up for another review this year. So next slide. And it really is, the first 4 sections of the guide are fairly standard. It will cover off how community can access their local hub. And as I said, we'll identify a number of local champions, people who are highly motivated. To act as key holders. So, and we'll introduce them to the facility owner. They get police checked. So we've got at least a minimum of 6 or 7 people within close walking distance of the hub that can open up the hub. They are briefed on some of the triggers of when a hub could be opened. The second section is how members of the community can work together within the hub. So we'll give them some very simplistic role descriptions. Things like you know, you obviously need someone who's going to be a bit of a hub supervisor. So again, you know, what's the process that they'll go through to appoint someone who could be the hub supervisor? Someone, again, with a bit of mana or respect within the community. Could be, again, a church leader or someone like that that can step up. We'll give them a bit of a role description about what the responsibilities of that particular position are. So part of that working as a team section is defining all those different roles in the hub. So there's the hub supervisor, there's an information coordination desk area, a public information, a reception kind of area. So there's a number of different roles that are defined within the hub guide, and there's a brief description around what they do. And it's really the kind of simple kind of stuff to enable good information management and a level of coordination between completely random people that might show up within the hub. The third section is how you go and set up your hub, things to look for, you know, if there's any kind of dangers or things like that, how they can space themselves in the hub facility so that they can, you know, work together in a logical kind of way. The fourth section is things to consider before you open up. Again, it's you know, it's all been written in very layman's terms. This hub guide, lots of pictures, lots of checklists. The fifth section is incorporating all that kind of asset mapping work and that problem solving kind of stuff we did during the three community response planning sessions. So we'll bring in, like, you know, the list of assets that the community have identified, some of the solutions that they've identified to some of those six kind of problems that they need to be addressing. And then the final sixth session is really their emphasis that, hey, listen, this structure that you've set up to enable yourself to be a part of the response is really also very good during the recovery stage as well. And it really helps enable the community to have some agency in their own recovery. And I'll go through that very shortly about what that section entails. So the next slide, sorry. So here's an example of what the guide looks like. I think Deb has sent you maybe a copy of it, if I'm correct. So you might be able to have a look at it in a bit more depth in your own time. But as I said, it's designed to be written for the 97% of people that never engage with civil defence. People that may just show up on the day and have some capacity to support their community, and they'll be able to read through the guide. We have a quick start version as well, and able to set themselves up to problem solve in a coordinated way. Next slide. This is a really popular part of the guide. This is really defining an example of some of the role descriptions that we define that can happen within the hub. And we actually practice this. So we run hub exercise days as well in our communities. And as I said, we now got to the point where the communities are actually actively doing this kind of stuff for themselves. And people like myself, emergency management advisors, are really just being invited along to observe and maybe critique. We've now had a number of different responses, both within our own region, but also in other regions, where these hubs have been activated and they've been tested under, you know, disaster type scenarios. You know, further feedback has been provided as to how we can further tweak some of these positions and also the hub guide. So it's an ongoing improvement process. But this is really popular amongst our communities because it's very kind of simple, common sense type, you know, roles that we're defining here to enable that kind of coordinated approach. Next slide. Next, so there's an example of maybe some of the bringing in some of the asset mapping into the guide. So it's the local resource list for that particular community. Next slide. And there's also listing some of the vulnerabilities. Also, so this is an example of where one of those problems I mentioned, one of the 6 problems that they'd have to be thinking about how would they continue to provide emergency water for their community if normal reticulated network was cut off. So they've listed all the types of different kind of community level water alternatives that sit within their community, like whether it's rural fire water tanks or the local pool or something like that. I don't know. That's the kind of, they've done all that asset mapping to kind of think about some of those kind of solutions pre-event. Okay, next slide. So then there's a section on thinking about recovery, and we discussed that with community as well. And it's like the importance of, you know, you've come together to be a part of your response, and how important it is to stay connected and to to maybe even continue the hub as we move out of response into recovery. How valuable it is in working together and speaking with one common voice to have a say in your community's recovery. So, that is an integral part of the hub guide. Next section. So what have we got out of all this? So we've got communities that have a better understanding of their risks. We have a clearer expectation of the kind of support that can be provided from CDEM, but also a stronger link between CDEM, and when I say CDEM, I mean Civil Defence Emergency Management, which is the official response. There's also acknowledgement from Civil Defence now of the role that community can play in the decision making. There's also a greater appreciation of community capacity, because when we run these hub exercises, for example, we also have members of the emergency services participating really as observers. We're very strong on making sure that it isn't a case of where the official response will come charging in and take over, because that's a good point that Lou raised. We actually make sure that if we ever set up things like a welfare centre, which is a facility that's managed by Civil Defence, it's not done at the same location as a hub, because we want to make sure that communities aren't disempowered and we don't take over the good work that they're doing, and that they work alongside us throughout the response and recovery phases. So we've got a known gathering points throughout our communities, and we have a structure and a framework that enable communities to problem solve. They feel empowered by the process, and they feel like they have a say and they can influence the decision making that happens at the official level. So we have a completely changed mindset between community and the official response as a result of this kind of pre-event planning and pre-event structure that we've been creating. Just recently, as I said, the Southland region down in Fiordland, the very, very wet part of New Zealand, at the very bottom of the South Island, they had some significant floods about 3 or 4 months ago. They activated something like 20 hubs, and over 1,000 members of the community were coordinating and responding to the problems being encountered in their own communities. And it really was an really valuing those skill sets that sit within community, those resources that sit within community, and how if they're coordinated well, they can actually solve a lot of their own problems before even Civil Defence gets up and going, and the official response can come in and support them. I think that might be the end of my slide pack. Is there another slide after that, Deb? Let's go.
Nope.
Okay,
that's
so
the best one.
That's pretty much it from my end. Yeah.
Wow, that was fabulous. Thanks so much, Scott. Oh boy, again, we could just listen for hours. I could do all this stuff. It's so interesting. What a great idea. And I think Peter had said something here about, wonder if there was a follow-up at a later date, putting Lou with someone from BC doing a similar gig, have them discuss the differences of approach, but also ideas that can perhaps be shared and adapted in other constituencies. Great idea, yes. Totally. I think that might be happening in future, Peter. Are there other questions that people have? Would someone like to just speak up or put your question in the chat session? Either way. So thanks, Isher. Yes, any funding challenges for community hubs, Scott, from Isher Lehel?
Yeah, I think one of the benefits of the model is that it's actually very simplistic, and it's also very cheap. So we'll use existing community halls or public facilities, and we only give them the very basic startup kit to get themselves going, and really emphasize sourcing resources from within their community during an event. So there's actually not a lot of funding required. However, now that we're seeing the hubs being acknowledged as being an integral part in terms of adding value to the official agencies, particularly around situational awareness and providing a voice on community needs, there is a desire to further improve the link with hubs. So as I was talking about, we're currently relying on an old VHF radio network, very traditional civil defence type thing. And we're now wanting to move towards more of a mobile hotspot type link, so that we can actually even further improve the information flow between hubs and emergency operations centres. So that's a real acknowledgement of the value that the official response has seen from hubs. And that's obviously going to require a little bit of investment. But I think as we see the hubs working so well and really empowering communities and providing them with that structure, we're going to probably continue to see further investment into helping enable that. The only other investment is obviously the community response planning that we do. So we'll make sure that we host really nice sessions with good food, and we try and make sure everything we do, our entire resilience engagement model, is built around having fun and really listening to people. So that we spend a bit of money on that from time to time.
Wonderful, thank you. And we have a couple more questions here, either for Scott or Lou or both, from Cheryl, confirming that animals are included as part of response and recovery in both Australia and New Zealand, correct?
They sure are.
Yes, here in Australia as well. It depends on the arrangements, but local government will enable them here in Victoria at relief centres. They've got partner agencies who set up pens and all those sorts of things. And even in Sydney, for example, Mass Care, they had a big exercise at the former Olympic stadiums, and people actually brought their horses to that exercise. So the Department of Primary Industries was setting up facilities as well to cater for that sort of thing. So it's definitely considered.
Thanks, Lou. And a question from Rachel. Thank you both. My question is for Scott. How did you go about piloting and building support for the Community Hubs program?
I must stress that this really has been an iterative community engagement process. We've tried and tested it so many times to finally get to the point where we feel like we've got something that's working reasonably well. I can't also stress the importance of engaging with those community champions, and that includes elected members, people within the community that hold a high level of respect and are kind of leaders of community networks. Getting them on board. We talk about really getting involved in our CRP process, community response planning process. I talked about 3 sessions. It's actually really 4, because I didn't mention session 0, where our community emergency management officers will actually spend hours and hours before we run our first community response plan of just simply engaging and talking with community around the concept, the value that community and the capacity that community have, and the importance of them being a part of the equation. So that session 0 process is huge.
Hey,
Thanks.
Deb, can I just say something on the back of what Scott said?
Absolutely.
It's really exciting to hear about the hubs there in New Zealand and the support for the hubs from government, CDEM. Having worked in recovery for 20 years and not really doing this stuff in my own local community, last year we started up a process of engagement with our neighbourhood house and all the community connectors, because I can see we're in a really high bushfire risk prone area, and I can see that unless we're connected, we're just one of many towns in our local government area. We won't be able to bring community voice and trust each other. So in a similar way, we're doing the same sort of thing here in order to impact the outcomes of the recovery of our community if a disaster should happen. So really exciting to see your model, Scott, and I'm definitely going to be looking it up to take to our neighbourhood house to help the process we're running here, which has been really developmental and slow. It's using volunteers' time, You know, the Woodend Football Netball Club knows so many people, but they're not really interested in doing this. It's not part of what they signed up for in leading the Woodend Football Netball Club, but it'd be great if somehow we can get them on board. So thanks, Scott. I really appreciated your presentation.
Yeah, good point.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Lou and Scott. And I have one more question from Peter before we go. To both Lou and Scott, is support for your organizations impacted by the election cycle, or is your support considered essential and supported no matter who is in power at the local and federal level?
Well,
I can go.
Yeah, sure. Mine isn't an organisation, we're a collaboration, so it's really about the value our members find in financially supporting the collaboration amongst each other. So, and you know, I guess some of that, yeah, I think, you know, it can be political. It depends on what level of the organisation it goes to. But at the moment, fingers crossed, we'll continue to be funded on a 2-year basis. Scott.
But for us, it's not so much a problem. Thanks to Mother Nature, we've had so many events in New Zealand over the last few years and the Wellington region having such a high risk profile that it's actually a hot potato for emergency management to be consistently and well funded. We're actually the only department of local government that's been amalgamated in the Wellington region. Simply so that we can get that kind of continuity of funding and also that boosted capacity to be able to do initiatives like this across the region. And the beauty of it is we've brought a model that works now on a consistently across the region. Every territorial authority used to have their own interpretation of how they delivered civil defence. Now we've got a nice consistent approach that happens across the region. And it's really paying dividends for the Wellington region because it's bringing consistency to our communities. We've got a community resilience team of about 7 or 8 emergency management advisors that work full-time in our communities, engaging with communities on a day-to-day basis and building those relationships. And that's what really helps us to develop concepts such as the Community Emergency Hub, because our EMAs, emergency management advisors, are there building those relationships and helping get these things off the ground, so that they're reaching the point now where the communities are running them. And we've got lots of evidence base now. We're starting to get a lot more evidence base to show that they actually do work and they are adding some value.
Thanks, Scott. And thank you both so much. This has been really interesting listening to what you're doing in your parts. Fabulous projects and initiatives. And thank you to everybody who has participated and asked questions. And we'll collect this chat session and send it out to you. There's a lot of different links and things in there, and including Scott and Lou's contact information if you would like to contact them separately. And one more note before we go, session 4 on the 10th of March will be, interestingly enough, about capacity of local governments, various perspectives and models and resources that are going to be presented from 3 different perspectives. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Deb. Bye.
Thanks, Lou. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, guys. See you.